Emma had always felt like life was a storm, unpredictable, overwhelming, and cold. One Monday morning, that storm felt more real than ever. She rushed into the office, late again, only to be met with the piercing voice of her boss, Mr. Thomas. "Emma, this is the third time this month. If you can't even manage punctuality, how can I trust you with bigger projects?" Her heart sank. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of pressure and self-doubt. She mumbled an apology and quietly retreated to her desk. But even after hours of work, she couldn't shake off the feeling that life was simply unfair. That evening, as she left the office, gray clouds gathered ominously above. It was as if the sky reflected her mood. Suddenly, heavy rain poured down. She didn't even bother running. Her steps were slow, defeated. Finally, she ducked under a small tea stand on the corner of the street. There, an old woman with silver hair and sparkling eyes, Mrs. Grace, sat behind the counter. Despite the rain soaking her shawl, she smiled warmly. "Funny thing about storms," she said gently, handing Emma a warm cup of tea. "They wash things clean." Emma sighed. "Or they just ruin everything you tried to build." Mrs. Grace chuckled softly. "It depends on what you choose to see." Emma couldn't help but roll her eyes. Another one of those overly optimistic people, she thought. Still, something in that smile lingered in her mind as she walked home in the fading drizzle. The following night was no better. Her mother sat coughing in the small living room. Emma dropped her bag, rushed over. "Mom, you should rest. You're working too hard." Her mother smiled weakly. "Darling, even broken soil lets new seeds grow." Emma blinked. Two wise women in 2 days, both talking in metaphors. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering, what if they were right? The next morning, on her way to work, Emma once again passed by the tea stand. To her surprise, Mrs. Grace waved her over and handed her a tiny paper crane. Small positive thought a day," the old woman said with a twinkle in her eye. "Start today." Emma hesitated, but took the crane, slipping it into her bag. At the office, she faced another tough meeting. Normally, she would sit silently, afraid of speaking up, but her fingers brushed against the paper crane in her bag. Without knowing why, she took a deep breath and said, "I have a suggestion." All eyes turned to her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Yet for the first time, the words came out clear and steady. Mr. Thomas leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "Now, that's the attitude I want to see." For the rest of the day, Emma felt lighter. It was as if she'd broken through something invisible, yet heavy. But storms aren't over in one day. The very next afternoon, disaster struck again. A major client emailed to say they were unhappy with her recent proposal and were considering terminating the contract. Panic clutched at her throat. The old Emma wanted to hide under her desk and cry, but now, she paused. She took out the little paper crane, placed it on the desk, and whispered, "Storms cleanse, start fresh." She picked up the phone, dialed the client's number, her hands trembled. The client answered, their tone sharp. "What do you want now?" Emma swallowed hard. I made a mistake, but I believe we can fix this together. Let me make it right." There was silence. A silence so long she thought the line had gone dead. Finally, the client sighed. "No one's ever spoken to me like that. You've got one more chance." Emma hung up, her heart pounding like thunder. But this time, it was excitement, not fear. She had faced the storm and survived. Later that evening, as she walked home, the rain had stopped. The sky was soft and golden. The scent of wet earth filled the air. She looked up. Sunlight after the storm. The next day at work, Daniel, her cheerful colleague, clapped her on the back. "You're not the same Emma from last week. Keep going." Emma just smiled, her heart warm. Days passed, and life felt different. She no longer woke up dreading the day. Instead, she greeted mornings with curiosity. One sunny afternoon, she decided to visit the tea stand and thank Mrs. Grace. But when she arrived at the corner, the stand was gone. Confused, she asked a nearby fruit vendor, "Where's the tea lady?" The vendor looked at her, puzzled. "You mean Mrs. Grace? She passed away last year, but she was special, always lifting people up." Emma's breath caught in her throat. A shiver ran down her spine. But I spoke to her this week. The vendor simply smiled. Maybe she found a way to visit you. Emma stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the tea stand once stood. Her heart swelled with gratitude and wonder. Months later, Emma stood in front of the entire company, presenting a project with confidence and clarity. She had become the kind of person people turned to for solutions, for hope. I used to see storms as disasters, she said, looking around the room. But now I see them as beginnings, a chance to plant something new. She reached into her bag and handed each team member a small paper crane. "Plant positive thoughts," she whispered, "and watch what grows." That evening, Emma walked home under a sky painted with pink and gold. In her hand, she held a small flower she had picked along the way. The storm was gone, the sunlight warm on her face. And somewhere in the gentle rustle of the breeze, she felt a whisper. Storms cleanse, start fresh. Emma smiled. She was ready for whatever came next.